The new community of nations that has grown up from the bits and pieces of the old European empires, the French, the English, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, is held together because we can organize. The last time a world empire fell apart was about 1500 years ago. Then the empire was Roman. The imperial provinces cracked up into small barbarian kingdoms. And all that big-time stuff you have to have with imperial government, you know, superhighways, theatres, aqueducts, were no longer worth the upkeep. That's why we're here, outside Arles. This aqueduct fed the biggest industrial complex in Europe with water to run the wheels of the great grain mills at Barbegal. 28 tons of flour a day, a technological marvel perhaps to be lost forever in the chaos. All through this period, the so-called Dark Ages, the one organization that still functioned internationally, still traveled the Roman roads when nobody else would, handling the king's local and foreign affairs because its members could still read and write, was the church. It had a fully operational network of communications from bishop to bishop throughout Europe, and that's what held things together. The church then was like our telecommunications now. And so the knowledge that the monks had accumulated gradually spread. Knowledge like how Barbegal had worked, with the great water wheel and the gearing system that made it so efficient. And in the end, by the Middle Ages, look what they did with that wheel. Here's the wheel being operated by water, and here's the gearing system turning the horizontal movement vertical, then horizontal again, and then vertical again in order to operate the millstones. Here's another system operating a trip hammer for bashing things like mineral ore or cloth or leather, soften it up. Here's a system that operates a similar trip hammer device, but it's to work a suction pump for a water supply. Same system again, operating two levers, pressing on bellows for a blast furnace. And finally over here, a crank that turns a circular movement into back and forward movement for a sawmill. Beautiful system. So, put yourself in their position. The wars are all over. There's loads of productive land everywhere. You've got water coming out of your ears and an amazing machine to use to harness the power. The great thing about these wheels was that they were easy to make and they'd work almost anywhere. You lived up a mountain, hollow a few trees out, and you had yourself a wooden aqueduct. Horizontal wheels didn't need gears because they spun millstones directly above. You could turn a vertical wheel with water falling from above or flowing past below in a river. And with gears, you could slow down the effect of a fast stream or speed up a slow one. Water power made you a lot of bread, in both senses. But the star of the show was this, the cam. With a cam, you can trip hammers to pound things with, harder and faster than any human being. And build yourself mills to work. Timber, oil, grain, leather, cloth, iron, beer, wire, sugar, coin, you name it. It took a lot of energetic monks to get it all together. Now, they were energetic because in 1098, a bunch of Benedictines, fed up with the luxury and the ritual, lit out for the wild country and the simple life. And St. Benedict's original idea that hard work was good for the soul. But it was the way these Cistercians organized themselves that turned them into a medieval multinational and gave Europe systems management. See, each monastery had to be self-sufficient in food, so they cut back on the praying and added 6 hours labor a day. They went into rearing animals, clearing and draining land, they went out looking for new plants they could grow, and they wrote each other reports on the latest developments. Like this one, growing vines on bad land, hillside terraces. They used all the technology available, wine presses, water mills, iron foundries. A Cistercian abbey was like a corporation, with the special advantage that at the end of a hard day's business, they served the house wine in the company canteen. Mind you, the food wasn't that hot. No meat, they sold all that. Just vegetables, nettle soup, a few roots, bread, and silence, while you listen to instructive selections from the Corporation Handbook on Getting Spiritual and Managerial Strategy Right, otherwise known as the Rule of St. Benedict.
Non veni facere voluntate meam, sed Deus quimisit me. Sed ecce ipsa...
Well, with this kind of organization, how could you fail? Within a century, there were nearly 600 Cistercian monasteries. These monks did everything with fanatical discipline. Nothing got in the way. No fancy architecture or ritual or color to distract from the corporate image of efficiency. And as their lands and their management techniques developed, the news spread to the world outside. Maybe their single biggest success was their sheep-rearing techniques, because by the 13th century, they were producing the best wool in Europe. With 90% of the population on the land, any development in agricultural technology would affect everybody. And in the 7th century, 700 years before Agincourt, 3 agricultural inventions came, one after the other, to fundamentally change people's lives. The first was a new kind of plough. You see, up till then, the plough in general use had been little more than a digging stick pulled by oxen. It came from the Mediterranean, where it's still in use today in the Middle East, and it was good enough for the job of turning over the light soil in that area. But up here in Northern Europe, it got you nowhere. Soil's too thick. So, when around 700 AD, this came along, it made a very big impression. It had wheels, it had a knife to cut through the sod, and the ploughshare had a curved board attached to it. This new plough would cut through anything. Look. Hey! You see what the knife does? It cuts open the sod and makes it easier for the ploughshare that follows. And then the curved board throws the soil up and away to one side, leaving a clean furrow. With a team of, say, 8 oxen in front of this, you could farm the thick, rich land up here that no earlier plough could ever have done. It was bloody hard work, but it could be done. So by about 900 AD, this plough was opening up the north really fast, clearing the forests, producing more food. And in consequence, the population was rising. Woo! Now, in those days, this would have had a team of oxen up front, not a horse. The plough and the oxen were very expensive. Few peasant farmers could afford the whole deal. So they formed cooperatives, each man bringing what he could. And as they began to work close together, they began to live close together in big groups, villages. That's why villages happened. So the first invention was the plough. The second came towards the end of the 9th century. The situation was that up till then they were using oxen in front of the plough, and if you put an ox harness on a horse, it cuts across under the neck and strangles the animal. The horse collar, that was the second invention, spread the load on the horse's shoulders, and so now you could use a horse. Now a horse will do twice as much work as an ox because it does it faster. So production doubled, and the population rose again. The third invention took them and their horses further afield. Yes, it was the horseshoe. See, with a shoe, you can use a horse in all weathers, over rough countryside, and it'll carry heavier loads further. So now you had a work animal and a transport animal. And by this time there was plenty to transport because they were producing so much, they had a surplus. You see, at the same time as all this, a new crop system came in, the idea of using 3 fields, the 3-crop rotation system it's called. One field is fallow, so the animals can graze on it and drop manure on it. One field is sown in the autumn with cereals like oats, for example, to feed the horses. And one field is sown in the spring with legumes, peas, beans, carbohydrates, vegetable protein. This was why they dropped the longbow, because when you have enough food to sell the surplus for cash, you've got better things to do on a Sunday than obey the law and practice archery. People went into business, they opened taverns, they even played games. So, there were the Europeans of the 12th century, with all that amazing water power technology and the red-hot industrial management systems worked out by the Cistercians, almost waiting for something to happen. Something that would generate enough money to trigger the economy off into high gear. And when that something happened, it was one of those examples of the way change can come about quite unexpectedly. Because the two inventions that were to trigger the great leap forward could never have been foreseen here in Europe, because they came from China. The Arabs brought them to us. And what a gift they were. The first one of those Chinese gifts was a new loom, and it immediately caused a problem. It speeded up weaving because the thread lifting business was now done by foot pedals, not by the weaver's hands anymore. The new loom produced cloth so fast, they ran into the problem of not enough yarn. See, up to then, you spun yarn in a way that hadn't changed for centuries. You teased the fibres out of the mass and hand-twisted them onto a spindle. Took hours. Then, in the 13th century, the second Chinese idea arrived and solved the problem because it produced yarn fast enough to keep up with the new loom. It was the spinning wheel. Early on, they didn't have much more than the wheel and the spindle. Foot pedals came later. But these two simple bits of machinery fitted together like bits of a jigsaw. And when they did, the places they were used got very, very rich. Places like Bruges. Bruges was one of the richest of the medieval cities built by the woolen trade. And if you know anybody called Draper, boy, were his ancestors well off. The cloth merchants made so much loot, they didn't know what to do with it. They built roads, canals, guild halls, cathedrals. They even had their own laws. And in spite of all that, they still had enough money left for high-technology music. Not just this kind of toy, the kind you can still hear in the cathedral towers all over Belgium, where the carillon still plays. Recognize the mechanism? It's the cam again, tripping levers that pulled wires that eventually pulled the clapper on one or other of a number of differently tuned bells. You set the cams in like pegs to trip certain levers and ring certain bells. Now, the reason all the good burghers had all these extra goodies was because they'd found a new market for their wool. See, all over Europe, people now had surplus, and surplus always looks for a ready market. South from Scandinavia and England and Flanders came fur and wool and cloth. North, through the Mediterranean, through Genoa and Venice, came silk and spices from the Far East. East, from France and Spain, came salt, wine, and Cordovan leather. And from Russia, fur, I suppose. Everybody's crossroads lay in the county of Champagne, at 4 little towns, where they set up the first international markets, called the Champagne Fairs. The biggest fair was held at Troyes, in those days half the size of London. And merchants turned up because they got a special safe conduct from the king and armed guards along the road. Of course, the town made a bit out of it too. You had to pay a license to set up your stall, and there was a sales tax. Isn't there always? And you had to pay to come in and out of town. Not that any of this bothered the merchants. They just upped the price. Funny how some things don't change. Well, there was so much money to be made here. And given the fact that the Genoese have always had a reputation for being where the profits are, it's not surprising that it was probably they who came up with a way to keep the financial ball rolling, so to speak, with this thing. It's an investment contract called a commenda. Now, this is a copy, but this particular one was written on the 14th of November, 1244, and it's a contract between a travelling merchant called John of the parish of St. Genesius and a draper called Otto, there's Otto, who is investing 81 Genoese pounds as a share in a load of purple cloth and gold silk that John the merchant is bringing up here to the Champagne fairs. The agreement goes on to say that John can use his discretion as to where and when he trades, on condition that when he gets back to Genoa, Otto gets detailed accounts and his share of the profits. This tatty bit of paper, which looks like an everyday affair, thing you write in the back of an envelope practically, represents a really fundamental innovation, because it brought everybody, rich and poor, who had any spare cash in on the act. And that spread the risk, and that encouraged more merchants to go to more places. So the Champagne fairs and others, places like this, really boomed. And then, at the beginning of the 14th century, came a change in the weather. Freezing winters and rainy summers. Bad harvests followed, and then famine. With little or no surplus crops to sell, money became tight, and the fairs began to fail. All over Europe, people tightened their belts. And in this weakened condition, they were virtually defenseless against attack. And when it came, in 1347, the effect was devastating. All the more so because they had no defense against the enemy. It was a flea. The flea carried the Black Death, and from when it arrived in Europe in 1347 on board ship from the Crimea to when it receded only 4 years later, it killed maybe 40 million people. 200,000 villages were totally wiped out. One grimly enjoyable thing came out of it all. The people who died left their money to the people who lived. All they could hope for was that they'd survive to enjoy it. Well, no nightmare lasts forever. By 1351, the worst was over. When it was all over, the survivors went insane, trying to forget the horror they'd lived through. Life everywhere in Europe became one long hysterical shindig. People spent the money the plague had given them on the wildest outfit they could buy. If you were rich, silk embroidered with gold wire was the thing. The middle classes went into expensive little numbers in wool and velvet. And the peasants? Well, thanks to that loom way back and the fact that flax is cheap to grow, linen was their thing. Well, it was everybody's thing, really, in hats and shirts and bed sheets. This is the first result of the great 14th century bed linen and underwear boom. The guy who used to go around collecting bones for fertilizer now started collecting linen too. He became a rag and bone man. Why? Well, that's the second result of everybody wearing linen, because when they wore it out, they threw it away. So there was this great pile of linen rag. And guess who went bananas about that? Okay, let me give you a clue. The first thing that happens to the linen in this process is that they take it and rip it against a knife to make the rags even smaller. And what is shredded linen rag absolutely perfect for making? Yes, paper. So the paper makers got an unexpected linen rag bonanza, pounded by hammers, tripped again by the can. You bash the rag in water and gum for 48 hours, and the sludge you get is paper pulp. Slosh that onto a wire mesh frame, count 5, and you've got yourself a sheet of paper. Well, a sheet of very wet paper. So the next thing you do, no prizes, is dry it. Funny coincidence, the wire mesh frame. A lot of wire makers about, making all that gold embroidery people had started wearing. Anyway, the paper. You lay each sheet between layers of woolen cloth to soak up the moisture. Looks more like a sheet of porridge, doesn't it? And when you've got a big pile of wool and wet paper sandwiches stacked up, you call the lads. All you do now is squeeze the pile in a press until you've got nearly all the water out of the paper when you hang it up to dry, and that's all there is to it. Funny how it all comes together here in the paper mill. The water power to run the cams, tripping the hammers to make the pulp, the wine press come linen press to squeeze out the water, and thanks to the automatic loom, the linen that makes the pulp. And because of all that free linen, suddenly the cheapest thing around was paper. This is one of those moments in history when things come together like a jigsaw to produce something entirely new. Look at the bits we've got so far. Because of the linen, we have cheap paper. The Black Death is just over, so the economy of Europe is on the up and up. Administration is expanding. There are many more clerks needed to do all the paperwork. However, the Black Death has killed half the clerks off, so they cost a great deal. So we have extremely cheap paper, and the cost of a man who writes on it has gone up astronomically. What do you need to solve that problem? Yes, printing. And that's exactly what happened. But before the final bit of the jigsaw could be put into place, you needed one particular skill, the kind of skill, say, a goldsmith has. If you come upstairs with me, I'll show you what I mean. You see, printing had been around for centuries, in the case of the Chinese for 1,000 years, but it was printing with blocks like this. The trouble was those blocks, being made of wood, would tend to wear down, and in any case, they only did the one thing. Now, what our goldsmith friend did, and by the way, his name was Johann Gutenberg, and he lived in Mainz in Germany in the 1450s, he used his expertise with precious metal. He knew what that was, the hallmark. And he knew that the hallmark was made with a punch. So he took a punch and he carved a letter on the end of it, and using the punch, he punched that letter into a soft copper bar. Then he designed a mold in 2 bits so that it comes apart. You put the mold together like that. You slide into the mold the letter you want to make, any letter. Close it tight with a big spring. Turn it over. And then very, very carefully, you put molten lead alloy into the mold like this. Leave it for just a few seconds, and then you break the mold, and the letter is there, ready to print with. And that letter A will go anywhere on the page you want to put a letter A. It will go in the place of any other letter A. The mold makes all the letters, so they're all the same size. It makes all the spaces, so they're all the same size. So the printing is uniform. But it's the interchangeability of the letters that is at the heart of Gutenberg's invention. If you think about it, it was a good deal easier for a European to do than, say, for a Chinese, because the Chinese language has thousands of characters, and if you made every one of them, you'd need a space as big as this printing room in Antwerp just to store them in. Whereas the Latin alphabet of the time only had 23 letters to be made. As for the printing itself, well, that was a bit of a cinch. This press was just an adaptation of a linen press that had been around for centuries, as had the ink and the paper. This is the first dated piece of printing we know of. There may be earlier ones, but this one has a date on it. And the people who did it were very proud of what they'd done. It's the introduction to a book of Psalms. And the text says, "This work, adorned with the magnificence of capital letters, was fashioned with the use of a mechanical process for printing and making letters without the use of a pen." And then it says the name of the 2 men who were so proud of what they'd done, Joachim Furst and Peter Schoeffer. And then the date, 14th of August, 1457. The coming of the book changed everything. Perhaps the most obvious change was the appearance of the bookshop, where you could come in and buy anything you wanted to read. Knowledge was no longer the private property of the priest or the prince or the scholar. If you could pay and you could read, it was all yours. The new books also standardized spelling. They carried an author's name, and they encouraged accuracy because The books could be widely read by people who knew more about the subject perhaps than the author himself. But perhaps most fundamental of all, the new books gave birth to the specialization that is the blessing or the bane, depending on your point of view, of our modern world. Because you see, the architects and the engineers started to write about what they knew in terms that only their co-professionals would understand. The generation that first read these new books could as easily turn its hand to the lute or the sword or the architect's drawing. And because of printing, they were the last generation to be able to do that. The coming of the books must have seemed as if it was going to turn the world upside down in the way it spread and democratized knowledge. And one of the few men responsible for that spread was an Italian called Aldus Manutius. And he realized that what people needed and wanted was cheap, standard books that they could carry with them anywhere they went in their saddlebags. And so he produced the world's first pocket edition. And he did so in what by 1500 was the printing capital of Europe, Venice. Used to blow their own trumpet a lot, the 16th century Venetians. Well, you couldn't blame them. There were, after all, more millionaires per square inch here than anywhere else in Europe. Biggest navy, biggest overseas commercial empire, biggest bank balance. Venice was queen of the seas. Of course, there was nowhere else she could have been queen of. Not much land in Venice. She was a city full of businessmen, and because of her connections with Constantinople, she was also full of Greeks, refugees from when the Turks invaded it in 1453. And it was the Greek connection that gave the printer Aldus Manutius his big chance. Because Aldus got the Greek refugees to work for him, and because of that, his books gave the world a taste for the knowledge and the style of ancient Greece. He turned out dictionaries and grammar books first, so his customers could learn Greek, and then, of course, they could move on to reading the Greek books he would sell them. No fool he. Well, the new books got everybody turned on to matters ancient. One of the earliest bestsellers was a Roman thing on architecture that got people into big prestige building projects, people like Michelangelo. Thanks to Aldus and the Venetian printing presses, in 1500, only 50 years after Gutenberg, there were no less than 20 million books in existence. In 1515, Aldus died. Aldus Manutius was laid to rest with his books heaped around him as a mark of respect for what he'd done, which was to print every major Greek classic in existence and invent a new kind of letter type for his pocket editions. It was a kind of print that would pack a lot into a tight space. We call it italic. So now the world could start worrying about something it had never had to worry about before: the small print. But above all, thanks to books, the world learnt about Greek science. This was one of the books that made the greatest impact of all, by the Greek hero of Alexandria. It details how to make machines using the natural forces of air, or steam, or water as power sources. It's really talking about complicated toys. But this book and others like it put the world of Greek science and the ancient past into the hands of the armourers and the architects and the engineers working for the princes and bishops of 16th century Italy.